Good morning and welcome to the first day of the 2021 legislative session. It's a session unlike any we have seen before. We are starting out with the Minnesota House operating completely remotely. We will have very limited staff and members working in the state capitol building because we want to protect the health and lives of state representatives, our staff, members of the public, and people who work in and around the Capitol complex. We are determined to make safety for Minnesotans and safety for the people who work for Minnesotans our top priority. This legislative session will see a series of questions and a series of tests for us. We will find out whether Minnesotans will accept the outcome of an election that was fairly decided and has returned a majority of DFLers to the State House. We will find out whether the state representatives are ready to maintain the fight against COVID-19 or whether they want to surrender that fight and let the disease rage. We will find out whether state representatives are ready to fight for Minnesota's working families to create better jobs, living wages, paid leave, childcare, affordable health care, and a secure retirement. This pandemic has laid bare the structural inequities in our political and economic systems. The rich and big corporations are getting richer, but working families are struggling the most. House Democrats are going to fight for our values until the clock runs out on this session. We are determined to make Minnesota a better place to live and work and thrive for everybody by the end of this legislative session. And we believe that we can make progress with Senate Republicans as we made progress over the last year. The challenges are significant. This is a big test for state government. It's a big test for Minnesotans, but we believe we can come out of this better if we continue to work together and work hard on behalf of working Minnesotans.
In some ways, we will see a very different 2021 legislative session than what we saw in 2019. By operating remotely, things will look different, things will feel different. The pandemic has certainly changed everything about our day-to-day operations at work and at school for all of us. But my hope is that the results will be similar to what we saw in the last biennium. Now, certainly there are enormous goals that we have for the state of Minnesota that we can only accomplish with a democratically controlled Senate. But in 2019, despite the difference in the majority Senate Republican approach and the majority Democratic approach in the House, we were able to reach a budget that served the people of Minnesota relatively on time and to accomplish other major policy objectives. We were able to take action on items that had languished, protecting people in long-term care, handling texting while driving, battling insulin and the opioid epidemic. All that was the result of bipartisan work. Here, going into 2021, we look back at the last year of 2020, we saw a lot more partisan conflict. It was a campaign year. At times, it was an ugly campaign year. At times, we saw Senate Republicans being pretty hard on Governor Walz, and I would say in some cases unfairly so. But nevertheless, during 2020, we did an enormous amount of good work for the people of Minnesota. Early on in the pandemic, we had four-caucus agreement to move very swiftly to provide assistance to our hospitals, childcare providers, and small businesses, and so many others. We came together early to protect our first responders who get COVID-19 on the job, to make sure workers' compensation was there for them. During the summer, we came together. We got done a very important bill on police reform and accountability, a first step, but a very important first step. And then in the fall, we passed the largest public works bill in Minnesota's history. And in December, our last special session, though very contentious, the work product was very important to the people of Minnesota. We provided assistance to small businesses, and we provided unemployment insurance for Minnesotans. We didn't have to worry about what was going to happen or not happen in Washington, D.C., because we had been able to come together on a bipartisan basis in Minnesota and get things done. So in some ways, you've seen this movie before. The players haven't changed. Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka, Governor Tim Walz, and I continue to lead. We have a good working relationship, and my hope is that the ending of the 2021 session will be relatively similar to the end of the 2019 session. We will fight like hell for the principles that we stand for. And no doubt, Senate Republicans will do the same. But in the end, I believe that we will compromise and we will enact a budget that's in the best interest of Minnesotans. With that, we're ready for questions.
All right, first up is Bill Werner. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you folks hear me all right, I hope, and thank you for taking the question. What it's about is where do we go from here on aid for Minnesotans who might need it if the pandemic's going to go on for a while, it looks like. On an unemployment insurance extension beyond what we already have, Senator Gazelka told me yesterday afternoon, I don't know that I expect another extension of unemployment benefits. He notes that passed the legislation in December. And on additional assistance for small businesses, restaurants and bars and others affected, he says they'll look at other ways to help small businesses, but, quote, we have to balance a budget that's going to be over $1 billion short, so it makes it difficult. So I appreciate if either or both of you would respond to that.
Well, Minnesota has tremendous resources to help us get through this pandemic, whether it is a hospital and a healthcare system that is resilient and able to do unbelievable numbers of tests, an economy that is doing extremely well in some areas and not others. And so we don't know what money we're going to have in a budget, whether it will be a surplus or a deficit by the time we get to cutting that budget. But we do know that there are Minnesotans in great need, and that the pandemic has hurt some people much more than others. And I think it's pretty callous to think that we can just step back and do nothing because we think that our budget deficit will get in the way. We have to help people when they need it. Otherwise, there is no point to having a state government. And so I think there may be places we can step forward and do a better job, whether that's unemployment or aid to small business, but it also could be through childcare, housing, rental assistance, a number of other areas where we have people in need and we have to make sure that they can make it through this pandemic.
One of the very first things we will be doing is unpacking that most recent piece of federal legislation. I think it was 5,000 or 6,000 pages. I believe that there is a lot of money coming to Minnesota, earmarked in several different areas. We know rental assistance, educational assistance. And first, we need to unpack what's in that federal bill and figure out how it meets the needs of Minnesotans and where there are gaps. I know the PPP program is much bigger and more robust and can give small businesses the kind of help that the state government is really hard pressed to give because just the enormous amount of resources that are needed.
Thank you both.
Okay, next up is Mary LaHammer. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question is about lessons learned so far during the pandemic, both good and bad, and things that might inform legislation going forward. Is there anything unique that you're hearing from your members or constituents that they want to see, carry forward? I know telemedicine was mentioned before. Anything else like that come through?
Well, you've mentioned probably the best example, telemedicine. From a legislative standpoint, I do think that Zoom hearings and Zoom meetings have in some cases been more accessible to Minnesotans. For Minnesotans who used to have to hop in the car and spend hours upon hours to drive to the state capitol, try to find a place to park, sit around and wait and testify, it's much more convenient to be able to testify by Zoom. We also know that for people with disabilities, some of our Zoom proceedings are more accessible. So I think we'll be looking to, after the pandemic's completely over and we have the freedom to do things in person or by Zoom again, I think we still will be using this type of technology to reach more people.
Okay, next question is from Esme Murphy.
Hi there. Sorry, I was not ready in line here. I guess my question goes, and thank you for taking the question. What about the governor's emergency powers and the restrictions for COVID? The governor is going to be announcing a rollback of some form on restaurants. Do you see those emergency powers continuing through the entire session? There are a couple of Democrats that have peeled off from you folks. Are you concerned about that in terms of these votes coming up? I guess they have to come up every month, right, still? Anyway, if you could just address that overall issue.
Well, there's 3 substantive issues and there's 1 procedural issue. So the 3 substantive issues are, number 1, should the governor continue to have emergency powers under 12.31. The second is, how do we feel about each of those executive orders? I think some of the executive orders have widespread support and legislators would not undo even given the opportunity. The third substantive issue is appropriations. The governor and the executive branch have been spending federal appropriations during the time that we haven't been in regular session, as is their right under statute. And I think there's been a lot of friction amongst legislators about some of the EOs and about much of the appropriating. Now that we're back in town, we are involved in every appropriations decision. So I think that's going to go a long way to resolve some of the tension. We will also continue to have some tension over particular executive orders and the approach that the governor has chosen to take, that certain legislators would have chosen a different approach. That's where I see the legislature being most active. With regard to the governor continuing to have the emergency powers and all the tools in the toolbox that he might need to respond to that pandemic, that is something I feel very comfortable that we will be upholding. Now, the procedural issue is during all the special sessions, when this issue has come up, it comes up on a motion to suspend the rules to take up the issue to have a conversation. And we have several members who have voted to suspend the rules and take up the issue and have the conversation. We have never really taken up the resolution and parsed it out and amended it and debated particular parts of it. If we get to that point on the House floor, and we will, it will be with regard to legislation that has been carefully considered in several committees and that has Democratic and Republican input, and then that we will send to the Senate. That will take a few weeks for us to take a look at how we might want to change the parameters of the existing emergency powers statute.
So that means that you are at least considering, it's on the table to look at revising this in some way.
It's really important to separate out the issue of the existence of the emergency powers and then the exercise of the emergency powers. And I think that everybody is willing to have a conversation, including the governor. And we've had several conversations about this from July through now, particularly with Minority Leader Dowd, about how portions of those emergency powers might be modified.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Ricardo Lopez. Go ahead.
Hi, Speaker. My question is, I just wonder if you could give us a sense about how you intend to govern this session in terms of maybe floor management, time management, given the dynamics of the session with the pandemic, remote voting, remote committees, and things like that, as well as you're having a smaller majority in the House and a divided legislature overall. I mean, how will you prioritize what bills come to the floor? I mean, what will you be looking for in terms of legislation that moves ahead? And can we expect, big debates on major policy questions this session?
We'll be very focused on the budget, but the budget is a moral document. And so you will see the Minnesota House DFL express its values in what we propose as a budget. We believe in investing significantly in education. We know we have some of the worst opportunity gaps in the United States of America, and we are very committed to doing something about that. You cannot do that entirely free. The other thing that we're very committed to is making sure that Minnesotans have affordable and accessible healthcare. That is a budget issue that will be front and center. And then economic security for all families. We think during COVID-19, it has become painfully clear that paid family medical leave should be something that every Minnesotan has in their workplace, as well as earned safe and sick time. So you will see us focusing and debating those substantive policy issues that we care deeply about. It will look a little different. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of switching from the roll call to the fingerprint voting technology because the roll call has operated in some ways as an adult's timeout. It has slowed up debate. You've seen during special session, there'll be all sorts of fighting and people kind of get all wound up, and then Chief Clerk has to read 134 names and not everybody's ready. So it takes even longer than it should. But people calm down. They take a deep breath. They cool off. They say, do I want to continue to engage in this fashion? It will speed up. We're going to switch to a technology that allows us to vote on our computer as though we're in the chamber. Our computers will test our fingerprints to make sure it's the actual legislator making the vote. So in contrast to the special sessions, things will feel a little bit faster on the floor. And you'll have to let me know your opinion after you see that in practice a little bit of whether it's better or worse and whether the adult timeouts were maybe a benefit.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next up is Kevin Featherly. Go ahead.
Hi, this kind of follows up a little bit on what Ricardo was asking. It's my understanding that there will have to be four-corner agreement on bills, so there will be fewer bills being brought forward for consideration. I wonder what that implies for things like police reform and for measures that might be revenue producing, like marijuana legalization, maybe sports gambling. It's been suggested to me that because the budget's in somewhat better shape, that those measures like that, revenue producing measures like that, might fall out of favor. I'm wondering, just specifically on those three things, if they really stand a chance, given that need for, quadrilateral agreement.
I think the majority leader can address the difference between special session and regular session and why four-party agreement is no longer the standard for legislation.
The only reason we ever needed four-party agreement during special sessions or at the end of last session is because we lacked the ability to run bills through the committee process in the regular order in the time that we had available to meet. So if the House passes a bill with a majority vote, that's one caucus, and the Senate will have a majority vote of its one majority caucus, and anything that we work out will go to the governor. The only time we need four-party is when we have a supermajority requirement. So that at this point is just a bonding bill.
I wonder if I can follow up with just a different question, just real quick. If you have any comment on the lawsuit that's been filed regarding the CBA, do you have any comment to that? Marion O'Neill and Mark Curran have filed suit.
Public employees have been the heroes of this pandemic. Nurses, epidemiologists, doctors. We have people who are stepping in to help families with childcare, paraprofessionals at schools, teachers. There are countless public employees who have helped Minnesotans get through this pandemic, and they have negotiated a contract, and that contract has been ratified. Republican legislators, on the other hand, have done nothing but get in the way of the response from public employees and have gotten in the way of our ability to fight COVID. And they are getting in the way once more of the people who are doing the work on behalf of all Minnesotans. I think their lawsuit is without merit, and they should focus on something more productive.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for just a few more questions if we go quick. Bill Werner had a follow-up question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. And again, regarding what the majority leaders of the Senate said yesterday, he's talking about in terms of balancing the budget using across the board reductions across various state departments. And also he says, and I know you're aware of this, he says no tax increases. That includes a gas tax increase, but nothing else at this time. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think lines in the sand are very constructive. It is expectable that the Senate would come in with an approach that says cutting only. We're going to cut critical government services. We can't afford it. That's their mantra since 1980, that we must cut things and we must reduce government, ignoring completely the benefit that those government services provide to the people of Minnesota. The majority leader just spoke very eloquently about the epidemiologists, the nurses, the doctors, the teachers. We need this type of assistance for Minnesotans now more than ever. They value these services that people provide. So number one, I don't like lines in the sand. Number two, I don't like that particular line in the sand. If we were to take a line in the sand, it would be no cutting. At the end of the day, the budget will be a compromise between the two different approaches. You can anticipate the Republican approach is all cuts, and you can anticipate that the Democratic approach is investing in Minnesota, investing in Minnesotans, and acknowledging the fact that we have enough resources, we have enough know-how and talent in the state to meet the needs of all Minnesotans. We don't have a scarcity of resources and talent. We can meet the needs of all Minnesotans.
And what about tax increases? Can you say that there won't be any, or will there possibly be some on upper income Minnesotans?
Well, I think the majority leader is kind of a caucus lead on this, but I would say that there are people who are not paying their fair share. If you look at during the pandemic, I certainly haven't slowed down my online shopping. There, in fact, I probably increased it to counteract some of the spending that I'm not doing in other of the service areas of my life that I would normally spend. I'm like pretty much every other American. There are people and industries who are doing better in the pandemic. And it's important that everybody's paying their fair share as we go through these tough times.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Next is Theo Keith.
Hi, Speaker Hortman. Hoping you can expand on some comments you made a few minutes ago about changes to the emergency powers law. What changes specifically would you support?
So, for example, we will be getting probably a large amount of federal dollars to provide rental assistance to Minnesotans. My guess is that the Minnesota Republican Senate will not be collaborative in dispensing that rental assistance to Minnesotans unless we talk about some modifications to the present eviction moratorium. The present eviction moratorium means that some landlords are stuck with tenants who might not be behaving so great. It's a little bit more difficult to get people out, even though there are exceptions in the moratorium, so they should be able to get out problem tenants. It's difficult. So that is one particular area I could see us moving on to enact a state law that essentially changes the executive order in a way that's palatable to the governor, the House, and the Senate in order to enable us to get the assistance out. That may be true in a number of other areas where there's federal funding that relates to issues in executive orders. And then there's just more broadly the issue of how the governor exercises the emergency powers under Minnesota Statute 12.31. And we'll be looking comprehensively at that and how to reform it. And Representative Jean Pawlowski will lead our efforts on that.
Is that, I don't know what your conversations with the GOP has been, but do you think those changes would be enough to draw GOP support? You mentioned that those changes would have to be bipartisan.
I think Representative Pawlowski has one of the best records in the legislature of being able to work in a bipartisan manner to get things done. And I know he has already reached out to Representative Haley from Red Wing, and the majority leader and I have already had a conversation with Minority Leader Dowd about this topic.
I also think the answer to your question of whether Republicans support it is the question of whether reckless Republicans who have a terrible record on protecting Minnesotans from COVID are the ones who are dominant in the Republican caucuses, or whether more responsible Republicans who've been able to work with us in a number of areas are the ones who come to the fore. So Representative Haley has been a good Republican to work with all along, but some of the behavior we've seen from others is completely, almost impossible to work with on this issue. And we are not going to sacrifice the lives of Minnesotans for the sake of a bipartisan agreement with people who do not care about the lives of Minnesotans.
Okay, next is Dana Ferguson.
Hi there. Even prior to the pandemic, we've seen some budget writing and lawmaking essentially done in secret. Wondering what assurances you can give Minnesotans that this year might be different and that these processes will be transparent.
Well, I reject the premise of the question. We have been much more transparent than any legislative majority that's come before us. It is difficult to have every piece of the sausage making viewable to the public. But you have seen us post bills publicly, have hearings on matters before they come to the House floor at a rate that's much higher than any of our predecessors. And it is something we continue to work on. We've asked our chairs to give maximum notice to the public of the hearings ahead of time. And so I know that committee hearings are not the most exciting things, and reporters don't love to cover them because they take a long time and parts of them aren't that exciting. But that's where the real work of the legislature gets done. We don't take up much on the floor that hasn't been heard in committee. Now, what would be great is if at the end of the session, when we have our budget bills passed off the House floor and the Senate has their budget bills passed off the Senate floor, if we could send those to conference committee and have public conference committees where you can see the chairs in the House and the chairs in the Senate work out the disagreements between their bills. We fought really hard with Senate Republicans in 2019 to have open and public conference committee hearings. And some of that happened. There were some really good pieces of the dispute that were aired in public. Then it gets to crunch time, and I think sometimes when it's at crunch time, that's when you see chairs kind of go behind closed doors and try to get things done more quickly.
Okay, last question from Brian Baxt.
Hey, good morning. As we're talking about COVID-related legislation and business fallout, has there been any discussion, or do you expect there to be any discussion around assessments on businesses to refill the unemployment account as is normally done, perhaps by putting that through the general fund instead, because some of these businesses have been kind of hampered and had to lay people off through no fault of their own?
Part of the agreement on, oh, go ahead, Ryan, on unemployment was that we wouldn't impact rates.
I think it's one of the issues we have to address early in how our state law interacts with the federal legislation extending unemployment benefits and what they are going to do with the debt that our state and every state owes through its unemployment compensation fund, or I'm sorry, yes, unemployment insurance fund to the federal trust fund. So much work to be done on that. And obviously anything we can do to use federal funds to avoid Minnesota businesses needing to pay, I think is fine.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.